we are still learning what triggered the shooter in Atlanta, but whatever his motivation, most of the victims were Asian. So to that end, what constitutes a hate crime and how do you try to prosecute it as a hate crime? Because it's kind of hard to get that label on the charges, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for having me here. And as soon as I heard about this case and started to follow the story, one of the first things that popped into my head is that there's no way that this is going to be charged as a hate crime. And not because I didn't want it to be, but because historically we know that it's very difficult for these acts of violence to be labeled as hate crimes unless there is some sort of overt bias that has either been written or documented, or that there were witnesses that heard hate speech that was shared or yelled at while the attack was happening. And I just already presumed that this was not going to be something they could find. One of the cases that I make very clear, or as an example, is the Orlando Pole shootings in 2016, in which 49 people at an LGBTQ club were killed. Most of them were Latinx. That was not charged as a hate crime by the FBI, despite the fact that the perpetrator traveled over 100 miles to get to the spot and to specifically shoot at this club. And similarly, this man from yesterday, he traveled dozens of miles and across different cities in the Atlanta metropolitan area and, really targeted these Asian American or Asian-owned businesses. And unless he has a dossier where he talked about how much he hated Asian people, unless he has witnesses that heard him say things that were anti-Asian or racist as he was, engaging in the violence,
right.
It would be really hard for it to be labeled as a hate crime.
Gotcha. Well, seeing that this is part of a larger series of incidents against Asian Americans, could this be categorized as domestic terrorism?
In an ideal world, it would be identified as domestic terrorism as well, or at least as, something beyond just a spree murder. However, it's very hard for something to be labeled as domestic terrorism either. Terrorism, according to the FBI, has to do with a political motivation. And so if his political motivation is hate based on race, or if he has some anti-Asian sentiments or a xenophobic sentiment, or it's related to stereotypes that he might have about the pandemic and the source of the pandemic, that could be considered political motivation. However, similarly, unless there is a dossier or some other evidence that demonstrates this overt and long-term political bias that he might have, it's really hard to charge it as such. And so a lot of these cases related to racism particularly, it isn't enough to be charged as either hate or as domestic terrorism.
Kevin, when it comes to what's driving these attacks, I get that COVID is a big source of unrest here because it originated in China. The Chinese Communist Party is certainly to blame for not containing it and not being transparent about it. But it's not like Asians in America are the Chinese Communist Party.
Right.
Also, I get that people are upset that there seem to be a lot of Asians who are successful economically, but it's not like the owners of these massage parlors were necessarily those kinds of Asians. So as a psychologist, explain what's behind the logic or whether there's a logic to the spate of attacks.
Sure. When people engage in any sort of violence, particularly, hate violence or spree murders that just kind of target, specific groups at random, that they really represent the fact that people are often scapegoating others. And so while there are lots of people who may blame China specifically for bringing coronavirus here, COVID-19 here. That might be part of it. Part of it might be the economic piece. Another part that we have to recognize is a lot of times hate violence happens as a result of backlash of things that are occurring. And so in this case, one of the hypotheses that I have, especially because it's in Georgia, is that Georgia has recently turned into an overtly blue state, that there are more Democrats representing Georgia than ever. Georgia is who was responsible for making the Senate majority blue. With the election of President Biden, which, ended President Trump's presidency, that there may be backlash related to that. And so when you view Asian Americans in this case already as to blame for this pandemic. And then also if you view them as some sort of population that can be easily dismissed or replaced or where their lives don't matter, then, that's what part of the people's motivations might be.
Kevin, really appreciate your giving us your perspective on this. Kevin Nadal of John Jay College of Criminal Justice.
The biggest stories the moment they happen from around the globe. Subscribe to Bloomberg Quick Take now for insight in an instant.